The U.S. political landscape erupted this week, sending shockwaves through both major parties and the public at large. The uproar began after former President Donald Trump made a stunning and unprecedented demand. He called for the arrest of California Governor Gavin Newsom, thrusting the nation into a heated debate over the boundaries of executive power. Trump's demand came in response to Newsom's refusal to deploy the California National Guard to quell widespread protests in Los Angeles. These protests had erupted following a series of controversial federal immigration raids, which many Californians viewed as heavy-handed and unjust. Speaking to reporters outside his residence, Trump accused Newsom of openly defying federal authority, claiming that the governor's actions endangered public safety and undermined the rule of law. He warned that such defiance could not go unpunished, and hinted at severe consequences for state leaders who challenge federal directives. "If I were Tom, I'd do it," Trump declared, referencing his former border chief, Tom Homan. With this statement, he escalated the dispute from a policy disagreement to a personal threat, intensifying the already fraught relationship between the federal government and California's leadership. By suggesting the arrest of a sitting governor, Trump not only tested the limits of presidential power and federalism, but also raised profound questions about the balance between state and federal authority in America's constitutional system. The statement ignited immediate controversy. Legal experts across the country quickly weighed in, questioning the constitutionality of Trump's demand and warning of the dangerous precedent it could set for the future. Many pointed out that such a move could undermine the very foundations of the rule of law. For many Americans, the idea of arresting a governor over a policy dispute was deeply unsettling. It evoked fears of creeping authoritarianism and the potential erosion of democratic norms that have long defined the nation's political culture. With just a single, provocative statement, Trump set the stage for a dramatic and potentially historic confrontation between federal and state power, one that could have lasting implications for American democracy. Governor Newsom's refusal to deploy the National Guard was a calculated defense of state sovereignty. Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass argued that local law enforcement was managing the protests and that military intervention would only escalate tensions. The governor insisted the Guard is a state resource, not a tool for enforcing controversial federal immigration policies. California's stance as a sanctuary state was at the heart of Newsom's decision, signaling resistance to federal overreach. By refusing, Newsom reaffirmed California's commitment to its immigrant communities and its autonomy. The standoff exposed the deep ideological divide between California and the Trump administration. Newsom's stand was a clear message: California would not be bullied into submission. The idea of arresting Newsom originated with Tom Homan, Trump's former ICE chief, who suggested the governor's refusal could be obstruction of federal law. Conservative media amplified Homan's remarks, framing Newsom's actions as unlawful defiance. As backlash grew, Homan walked back his comments, clarifying he wasn't seriously calling for arrest, but expressing frustration with uncooperative state officials. Despite Homan's retreat, Trump seized on the idea, escalating it into a direct threat. This pattern, an associate floats a controversial idea, Trump amplifies it, became a hallmark of his political strategy. The narrative of Newsom as an obstructor justified the administration's next steps. Homan's rhetoric, even softened, laid the groundwork for federal action. The episode revealed how political messaging can quickly morph into real-world consequences. In a dramatic escalation, the Trump administration federalized 2,000 California National Guard troops, stripping Newsom of command. Invoking Title X, the White House claimed the protests obstructed federal law, justifying the move. California officials called it an illegal abuse of power and filed a federal lawsuit, arguing the conditions for federalization were not met. The legal battle centered on whether the president could override a governor's authority without a true rebellion or emergency. The administration argued federal intervention was necessary to protect agents and enforce immigration law. California countered that the move was a political stunt, not a legitimate response. The lawsuit became a pivotal test of federal versus state power. The arrival of federalized National Guard troops in Los Angeles marked a turning point, transforming what had been a tense but manageable situation into a full-blown crisis that gripped the city. The sight of military vehicles rolling through familiar neighborhoods and armed soldiers taking up positions on city streets sent shockwaves through the community and signaled that the stakes had been raised dramatically. What began as largely peaceful demonstrations against ICE raids quickly escalated. Many protesters who had gathered to voice their concerns and demand change now found themselves facing troops in full combat gear. For many, the presence of the National Guard felt less like protection and more like an occupying force, intensifying feelings of anger and frustration among the crowds. Tensions exploded on both sides. Protesters, emboldened by the growing crowds and the national attention, clashed with law enforcement and the Guard. Authorities responded with increasingly aggressive tactics. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and projectiles filled the air, turning city streets into chaotic battlegrounds. Over 50 arrests were made in a single night, as the city became a battleground between federal power and local resistance. The scenes of handcuffed protesters and chaotic streets underscored the deepening divide between authorities and the community. Residents described living in fear, with businesses shuttered and daily life grinding to a halt. Once busy neighborhoods became eerily quiet as people stayed indoors, uncertain of what might happen next. The sense of normalcy was shattered, replaced by anxiety and apprehension. The deployment, intended to restore order, instead deepened chaos and resentment. Night after night, clashes erupted between protesters and troops, with neither side willing to back down. The city's wounds grew deeper with each confrontation. The city's fabric was torn by the conflict, leaving lasting scars on both the landscape and the people. Burned vehicles, shattered windows, and graffiti became stark reminders of the turmoil that had engulfed Los Angeles. The federal response, meant to quell unrest, instead turned a protest movement into a full-scale crisis of civil disorder. The confrontations grew larger and more intense, drawing national scrutiny and sparking debates about the use of force. In the aftermath, Los Angeles was left reeling from the consequences of this unprecedented escalation. The city faced not only physical destruction, but also a profound sense of loss and uncertainty about what the future would hold. The street clashes were matched by a fierce war of words among political leaders. Trump took to social media, claiming the Guard saved Los Angeles from total destruction and mocking Newsom and Bass as incompetent. His rhetoric painted himself as the decisive savior, casting state leaders as failures. Newsom and Bass fired back, condemning the deployment as dictatorial and unnecessary. They argued the crisis was manufactured by the White House and that local authorities had the situation under control. Newsom called Trump's actions a deranged fantasy and a step toward authoritarianism. Bass emphasized the federal presence was inflaming tensions, not helping. Both leaders framed their resistance as a defense of California's values and autonomy. The battle for public opinion became as critical as the events on the ground. Federalizing the National Guard without a governor's consent is an extraordinary measure, one that has been used only in the most critical moments of American history. Traditionally, this power was reserved for times of deep national crisis, most notably during the Civil Rights era, when state governments refused to uphold federal law or protect citizens' constitutional rights. Past presidents, such as Dwight D. Eisenhower and Lyndon B. Johnson, invoked this authority to enforce Supreme Court decisions and ensure the safety of those fighting for equality. In Little Rock, federalizing the Guard was essential to integrate public schools, while in Selma, it protected peaceful marchers demanding voting rights. These interventions were seen as necessary steps to expand and defend civil liberties. Decades later, the Trump administration's decision to deploy the Guard in Los Angeles marked a stark departure from this legacy. Instead of supporting the expansion of rights, the move was widely viewed as an attempt to suppress public dissent and protests against federal policy, raising concerns about the intent behind such federal action. This reversal of precedent alarmed historians and legal scholars alike. Many argued that using emergency powers in this way undermined the original spirit of federal intervention, which was to protect citizens' rights, not to silence opposition or bypass state authority. By contrast, during the 1992 Los Angeles riots, the National Guard was federalized only after the governor formally requested assistance. This reflected a long-standing tradition of cooperation and mutual respect between state and federal governments, emphasizing partnership rather than unilateral control. The unilateral federal action taken in 2025 broke sharply with this established norm. It signaled a significant shift towards centralized federal power, raising alarms about the erosion of state autonomy and the balance of power in the American system. Many experts and commentators warned that this set a dangerous precedent, potentially opening the door for future administrations to override state authority whenever it suited federal interests, regardless of local needs or consent. Ultimately, the move raised fundamental questions about the future of American federalism, the limits of executive power, and the delicate balance between national security and civil liberties that has defined the nation's history. Legal experts and advocacy groups swiftly condemned the federalization of the Guard as a dangerous overreach. National security analysts warned that military troops are ill-suited for managing civil unrest, increasing the risk of violence. Civil liberties groups called the deployment a threat to free speech and a chilling precedent for protest rights. The administration's threat to deploy active-duty Marines further alarmed critics, raising concerns about the militarization of domestic policing. Experts warned that using the Guard against state wishes erodes public trust and politicizes the military. The crisis, they argued, risked long-term damage to the relationship between the military and American society. The consensus? This was a reckless gamble with far-reaching consequences. The standoff between the Trump administration and California plunged the nation into a constitutional crisis. Trump's camp argued the president had ultimate authority to enforce federal law, even over state objections. Newsom and Bass countered that the deployment was an unconstitutional assault on state sovereignty and civil liberties. The legal battle over the Insurrection Act would set a precedent for presidential power. With federal troops on the ground and protests ongoing, the stakes could not be higher. The outcome will shape the balance of power between Washington and the states. The events in Los Angeles exposed deep national divisions and fears of creeping authoritarianism. The nation now faces a pivotal test. Will it reaffirm federalism and democracy or move towards centralized, unchecked power?